Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and hopefully, welcome back to another episode of the Wholistic Center, the podcast that looks at what does ancient wisdom survives today and what does it have to offer our societies. My name is Nicholas Zart, and I have been preoccupied with these things since as far as I can't remember, despite having made a living and a career in something very different. But eventually, sometimes things come together. I hope you had time to read on the wholistic center.com, and remember it's holistic with a W, so WHO, etc., so on and so forth, the wholistic center.com, our series on Hermetic philosophy, because it actually gave me an idea to do the same for this topic, which is Gnosticism. So if you don't know anything much about Hermetic philosophy, well, it's a big umbrella. And as I explained in the 7-part series, it's a big umbrella that has different roots, different traditions, despite more or less all of it really is starting in about, ancient Greece and then drawing from ancient Egyptian philosophies. And so it sort of gets spread out everywhere, including a revival in the Renaissance in Italy, and eventually, finally, here in the United States and Europe, early 1900s. But for this part, the Gnosticism, I wanted to also take a kind of a stab, and I think this one will only be a 3-part series. It's not as complicated, thankfully, as Hermetic philosophy, but it is an umbrella term. And I wanted to differentiate what is Gnosticism, what was it, and what does it mean today? And so, for one thing, there is no Gnostic religion. It just doesn't exist. It's a term, an umbrella term that sort of recoups the early Christians, the ones who had a very holistic view of the universe that was very different from what later on the church imposed pretty much all over Europe and pretty much the rest of the world. So what does Gnostic mean? Gnostic means the direct knowledge. Now, for some of you, depending on how old you are, you might be at that point in your life where you want to find out really, what do you think? What do you see? What is going on inside of you? So first of all, welcome. You're in the right place, because we're all asking the same questions here. No masters, no gurus, no teachers. However, just a lot of people who are thinking about what does it mean? Who is the real me? And in fact, I think a few years ago, I wanted to write a book, and I'm still finishing another book in the meantime. And one of the chapters was going to be called, Will the Real Me Stand Up? In other words, how much did I learn? How much did I take on from my parents, education, friends, lovers, etc., so on and so forth? And how much is truly, really mine in the end? And I find myself at this part of my life, and I'm sure a lot of my friends of my age are probably feeling the same thing, is, I learned a lot, done a lot, and I've acquired a lot of skills, but deep down, what is my real gnosis? What is my direct knowledge? And that's what gnosis is. So Gnosticism means that. And it also means a heck of a lot of things, which we'll see. So today, Gnosticism is used to talk about a certain period of our lives, which really was the proto-Christian era. This is really a rebirth of philosophies, sort of an introduction to religions. But it happened in a place, in between what we now call Israel to Egypt, at a time when a lot of movement back and forth between East and West, and of course, a lot of exchange. Now, of course, mercantile exchange for one thing, since, we've had the Spice Road, the Silk Road, whatever you want to call it, but also philosophies, ways of living that were different from one place to the other. And of course, wise men traveling from the Far East to that center of the world, from the northern Celtic regions all the way down to that part. And you might be surprised to find that they did find, by the way, a Celtic coin, right? I'm talking about Druids, with the Buddha sitting cross-legged with one hand down, which is one of the typical positions of the Buddha in full enlightenment mode, but connected to the earth. It's really beautiful and precious to see something from that far away having made it all the way up there. And so really the epicenter of all of that is what we now call Jerusalem, all around that part, which, of course, as you are well aware of, was the birthplace of Christianity. So all of this really, and I have to look at my article because I'm going to lose track of everything. all of this really starts in the sense of Egypt, really, more or less, to be clear on that. And by the way, in Egypt, the Coptic community, which is, the proto-Christian community, has kept very true to this early Gnostic world. And also another community that has kept very true to this is the Ethiopian Christians. And if you ever read their Bible, you'll find out that it includes a lot of things that were dropped from the conventional church's Bible. It's a much more fuller Bible than we're led to believe. So in 1945, Muhammad al-Samad found a bunch of clay jars, and inside of them, a bunch of written rolls and everything. Sadly, he used some of them to make a fire. But finally, when he realized what he had in his hands, he thought this could be important. So he gave it to the authorities. And it was the biggest shakeup, the biggest revolution, religious, philosophical, that has almost ever happened. I would say right on par with Hermeticism, where everything turned back. The deeper questions were coming out. The way people looked at Christianity and the way the church, the Vatican, had shown it, just was begging for a lot of answers, which Hermeticism, by the way, did try to answer, and certainly has answered in lots of ways. But this were the scrolls of the earlier proto-Christians, how they saw the world, which was, it turns out, very different from what we know today. Now, of course, at the center of these scrolls, there are a lot of different stories. Unfortunately, they're not complete, all of them. At the center of that is the Apocryphon of John. And this one is an eye-raising one. And we're going to go through the stories of all of these. But, 1,500 years later, these stories coming up are an interesting review of where the Christian church has led itself, led its population, and where all these questions are finally finding a good foundation. You're right to ask questions. There's nothing wrong with that. But it also ruffles up a lot of feathers, understandably so. The view that the Gnostics had, again, these early proto-Christians, was very different than the view that the church adopted much later on when it when it became the church, right? And so before, God was seen as this, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipowerful deity, the source of all life, the creation, the energy behind of life, but not as this vengeful, gray bearded old man, ready to snap you because you sinned. And in fact, they didn't see us as sinners. They saw us as, we were born perfect, but life is what it is. We don't always remember exactly why we're here, what we're supposed to do. And of course, when you live in a society that's hardwired in one direction, sometimes it's really hard to get back to the fundamental. And that's what it means, Gnostic. Gnostic means to get inside of you and find out exactly what is that direct knowledge that, you and I have, everybody has, which may or may not be easy to find. But we're getting there, right? This is why we're all here. So this Gnostic central message of this unifying central theme called God, which, by the way, they call the monad. And of course, there was a sort of a trickle-down effect, right? I mean, it's not just the monad and us, it's the monad, and then it's the pleroma, where you have these perfect entities, they're just one step removed from the monad, from God. And then within that, you have the other emanations, and which we're a part of. And we specifically sort of like are in between these guys. There are wonderful stories about Sophia having given birth to the demiurge, who didn't really know what it was, and it's very boastful. We'll get into that very much later, because that gives you a really good idea of how I feel the church was established by using just this little nugget. So we've already talked about the word Gnostic, but it's really just a difference between theology memorized from catechism to direct knowledge, and this is really what we're about. It's good to know, it's good to learn, and it's good to hear others, but ultimately You have to do the work. And this goes back to something we visited plenty of time on the Wholistic Center is don't look at the finger, look at where it's pointing, right? So a guru, a really good guru, and by the way, I have an article coming out on be careful with these modern teachers because a lot of them are taking shortcuts. A lot of them are not trained the way they want or they should have been. And a lot of them are taking such shortcuts that it might leave you in a really bad place. There's a reason why Hermetics means not leaking out any information. There's a reason why it took 50 years to become really good at Tai Chi Chuan, why it takes so long to become a Dzogchen master or Taoist. There's a reason. And it's very normal for us Westerners, very materialistic based, to want to go faster. We're not happy, we're uncomfortable. We want to find the solution. We're also raised in a society that points to outwards. The savior, the Messiah will come and help you. Well, not so much. Gnosticism says, no. The answer is within. Now, you may listen to other people, and that's why you and I are talking right now. And hopefully, I want to hear more from you. But there's also a point where you have to go, interesting. How does this resonate with me? Does this sound true? And who does it profit? Where does it profit, right? Who profits from this? So those are the questions you need to do, and you need to internalize that, and you need to go deep down inside. That's why meditation is so good, because you're finally left to yourself, to your thoughts, to go deep inside. And once you still that mind, answers come up all the time. And I hope you did get to see the last podcast on tea making, because tea making is just such a great part of it. That's why the Tibetans drink tea. Because tea wakes up the mind, but not jitter the body. So Gnosticism was never a religion, ever. Nobody ever said I'm a Gnostic. I mean, people say I'm a Gnostic, but it actually means a lot more than that. Now, there are modern versions of Gnostic Christianity, and they're really interesting because there's not a single predetermined preacher. Everybody gets to preach. Everybody gets to do everything. It's a very free community. I almost wanted to say very communistic society, but please bear with me. So there were different Gnostic schools, by the way, but all of them, even though they had slightly different cosmologies, it was mostly the idea was always the same. Yeah, they had different practices, and of course they had different teachers, but the single thread was that the divine spark lives within every human being, and this is undeniable. And you find that in Dzogchen, you find that in Taoism, you find that pretty much in almost all ancient religions, the Vedantas. And so you don't need to obey another teacher. You don't need to obey an institution. Listen, be respectful, obviously, but find your own way. And this is really what the Wholistic Center is all about, is find your holistic center. Go back in there and have fun. So direct knowledge is what we have left at the end of the day, and that's beyond rhetoric, right? You wake up with yourself, you fall asleep with yourself. That is the one fundamental truth you have, besides the fact that one day you will shed this experience, this body and all of that. So those are the fundamentals that we know. So those were the deep conversation that Gnostics were having in the beginning, and of course, this is a lot of influences that come into the Hinduistic aspect or concept of Atman, the divine self, the Buddha's. Buddha nature, when you finally rid yourself of all of that. By the way, using Kundalini, that if you do train well and you do prepare your body and your mind, yes, that energy can rise, and then all of a sudden, boom, you have that nirvana moment. But if you don't, beware. It is not fun. And it's plenty of examples right now going around on YouTube saying, be careful with these teachers. This is what happened to me. So let's get back to these texts, because the Nag Hammadi texts are fascinating, because they change everything. They shed a light on Christianity that, well, a few did remember, but not a lot of people actually remember that. And the Apocryphon of John opens up with something that we can pretty much all relate with, right? So John is there, sees the Christ die, and he's going around in the streets and he's preaching and everything, and someone makes fun of him, and he goes, "Ha! your eternal God died. And that shattered John's belief because he didn't know what to answer to that. But he did the best thing ever. He went into hypnosis. He went inside of himself to find out what's going on. And of course, he did it the way so many people do it. He went into a retreat. Of course, he didn't go in a monastery on top of the Himalayas or in the Andes. He went in the desert, virtually in a desert where he heard something. He felt something. And that something was very interesting because at one point it was an old man. At one point it was a woman, and at one point it was a child. And he couldn't make sense of this because again, he was really used to seeing, the normal way all of these people, all of us have been raised to think about the divine entity. And that sort of morphing image said, I am the Father, the Mother, and the Son. So now you can kind of get an understanding of of the Christianity part of it. In that single line right there, it dismantles everything about a solitary God who's vengeful and will snap at you because you did something wrong, because you sinned, which, by the way, sin in Latin means without, to be removed from. Remember, this is like Doc Chen again. You're perfect. Yeah, the view, not that great. Needs to be clean. Kind of glasses, right? The mirror, the crystal. These are wonderful imagery that they use. And that means, the female aspect of it, the male aspect of it, the youthful aspect of it, which again, we're represented that is very well represented in Hinduism, right? Where we have the Brahma, where we have Vishnu, where we have Shiva, and Shiva the destroyer, Vishnu the nurturer, Brahma the one that creates. And all three of those things, they work pretty well together because that's us, right? We're created from a spark. Then we nurture ourselves every day. I have to eat, drink, go to the bathroom, basic stuff, right? But eventually, this gets shed, right? And then what happens after? We'll let it. We'll get there anyway. We don't need to talk about it right now. So the Gnostic movement brings this invisible spirit back to the center of our existence and reminds us that it is right here the whole time. And that goes back to another story I wrote on the Wholistic Center about, I can't remember exactly where this one comes from, but it was told in many different ways. But, God one day is sort of sad because humanity is not really using its divinity very well. It takes it for granted and thinks, I'm going to remove the human's divinity. I'm going to hide it somewhere. So he thinks, here's a good exercise. I'm going to ask all the gods around me, where should I hide this divinity? God of the sea says, well, we'll just bury it at the deepest levels of the sea. And then God says, yeah, but you know what? One day humans will build boats and submarines and they'll go and visit everywhere. So the God of the earth says, well, very simple. We'll just go to the deepest caves and hide it there. So God says, again, they will explore every crevices on this planet. So the God of the air, very, very arrogantly says, well, we'll just put it in the highest place in space. And God says, well, you know what? Eventually, they'll have spaceships and they'll go and visit and everything. He looks at them. He doesn't see anything coming up. And he goes, I have an idea where a human being will not think about for a long time until there's really nothing left to do. And they're all thinking, all the other guys are thinking, what? And he goes, right there, right in the center of its being. It's pure. It's brilliant, right? Because again, at the end of the day, you're left with yourself. You may carry all the books you want, all the crosses, and keep as you want, but in the end, it's just you. And that's important. This is really what Gnosticism gets us back into. But remember how we talked about the pleroma? The pleroma is where these realms of divine realms are. And different Gnostic schools will explain the pleroma differently, and its cosmology changes somewhat. Pleroma means fullness, okay? And it's pure light, pure awareness, and it's populated by divine intelligence, and they're called the eons. And that's why we get that word here that means forever, eons. I've been, looking for you for eons. Among them is a very special eon, and her name is Sophia. Now, it's not a woman per se, but it's a female principle called Sophia. Now, all of these eons at that point are separated in two, and they're not physically really separate, because first of all, they're not physical for one thing, but there are an aspect, a differentiated aspect of the monad of God, and they work in tandem. And Sophia had her counterpart, except that Sophia wanted to express the beauty of the monad, and she wanted to create like the monad did. So she created her own entity, but without her counterpart and without the approval of the other eons. And this is the beginning of the problems, which the Christian church has used, sadly, to a very nefarious ends, to demonize the female, the feminine concept inside of us, to belittle it, to squash it. Because if you remember well, in the Garden of Eden, Eve is the one who messes things up. Well, not really, because once you read these ancient texts, you realize that the Garden of Eden was nothing about that, quite the opposite. But we'll look at that a little bit later. So Sophia creates this demiurge, and its name is Yaldabaoth. And it doesn't know anything. This is a brand new infant with a lot of power that comes in, doesn't know that there is a God above it, that there is a creator of all things, and just sees itself as the ultimate creation and goes, I am God. I am. Wants to be the monad. He thinks it's the monad, right? And of course, Sophia looks at it and goes, oh my God, what did I do? What did I create? Now, don't be fooled, because the monad, if it is what it is, omniscient, omnipowerful, omnipresent, there was a reason why that happened, right? It wouldn't have let something like that happen if it was counterproductive. And you can't add anything, subtract anything, divide anything, multiply anything to the ultimate, the all, the infinity of it all, right? There's no such thing, right? So nothing happens without a reason. But the reason is obvious, probably, maybe not. But the reason was to experience it, and not that there was a need to want to experience it. But anyway, we can go on that one forever, and we'll never get the answer to that one until, well, we shed our dualistic minds. So ignorance of the higher realms, Yaldabaoth thinks it's the ultimate stuff, right? And it really, this is the beginning, by the way, of the God of Genesis, the vengeful God that punishes you when you do something bad. And it's the Old Testament. And it's a beautiful read, because it really kind of gives you that aspect of what the Gnostics had found out, but that has been reinterpreted in a way to make it look like we're sinful from that. We're not created by Sophia's creation. We really are directly from the source. So up to you to draw your own conclusions. And if this irks you, by the way, just skip, go somewhere else, and that's totally fine. So this is where Gnosticism becomes very personal at this point. Yaldabaoth does fashion humanity in a certain way, has a say in it, but it really only creates bodies, and it cannot create life in and of itself. In other words, it can create the shell, but not the magical spark, that which Sophia had and also gave to him. But for some reason, he cannot, or it cannot do it. So it could replicate the form of a divine being, but not produce the essential ingredients, which was the spirit. So this is the spirit that we have, and some of us have a more present spirit than others. So in a moment of cosmic irony, the higher powers tricked this Yaldabaoth into breathing its own stolen light, a fragment of Sophia's divine essence, unknowingly, and that is carried into the human being. And this is really how we come about, for some odd reason. And why, once humanity is awake and understands that original breath, right, and go, wow, that's the real nature. This here, that's the physical, tangible reality that I'm exposed to, but it's not the ultimate reality. There's something else here. And then you might have noticed, obviously, even if you're a skeptic or you don't believe in anything, damn, sometimes there are things that happen that just makes you go, wow, that's kind of weird. Like the other day, I thought about one thing, then I read about it, and then I saw a video about it, and I thought, all these weird coincidences. And of course, we can always explain coincidences, but after a while, you kind of have to stretch your mind and go, maybe what's going on here? So this Gnostic vision of the human condition, which everybody, carries that spiritual, that divine spark inside of it, is a fragment of the divine pleroma. And by the way, the divine spark is called pneuma. And this is a really interesting concept because pneuma is really what pervades this whole observable universe of ours. So it's an interesting old Greek word that's been used over and over and over again. Yaldabaoth needs, of course, entities to help him control his dominion. Remember, he's not the real God, so he can't just let people go free. He's got to control them. And also, since he cannot create divinity out of nowhere, he cannot create a spirit out of nowhere, he's going to need to use the energy to continue creating. And hence, we have this sort of slavery that happens with humanity. And in order to do that, he creates the archons. And the archons are other lesser entities that feed on the energy of the unsuspected human being so that it keeps the whole system alive. Now, if you've seen The Matrix, this is probably one of the best example of Gnosticism. It's very complicated, but please watch it over and over and over again. It'll make a lot more sense. It's probably one of the best Gnostic reinterpretation of this world. The stories of Bagger Vance, by the way, if you want to find out a little bit more about the Bhagavad Gita, that's a great one too. Donnie Darko is also a really good one when it comes to Gnosticism. But these archons are lesser powers that govern the material realm. And in here too, we need to make a little side note. In the material realm, there are two leading, and when I say the material realm, I mean this life right here on Earth. There are two leading entities that are sort of spreading humanity thin. There's Lucifer and there's Ahriman. And Ahriman is well exemplified here in the United States, where in the Western world, mostly where everything is material. You want possessions, you want power, you want money. Greed takes over. And that's why in the 90s we had idiotic concepts such as what's wrong with a little greed. Yeah, it's always been wrong. And one of the original deadly sins, if you remember that one. On the other side of the things, you have Lucifer. And Lucifer is another quite interesting character who tries to draw us away from the physical life, tries to get us to go, nah, that's bad stuff. You don't want to concentrate on that. You want to meditate all day long and stay in your etheric world where everything is peaceful and everything. Obviously, neither of these two extremes are really good ultimately because, well, hey, guess what? I still live in 3D. I still need to drink my tea. I still drink water, eat food, go to the bathroom. I cry, I laugh. I'm still here. Although I embrace fully 5D, I'm very cognizant that my body operates right here in 3D. And yes, the energies will be raised in due time to transcend that, but there will always be others that will continue this mortal coil all the way up there. So don't negate anything. Don't fully embrace everything and let go of everything else. Just stay in your holistic center, for lack of better terms. So these archons are just kind of like sucking the energy out of humans, and they don't want you to get out of the matrix. Why? Because, well, it sustains a system, right? Why does a system like that work? Yeah, that's a great question that you need to go and meditate on your own and find what is your Gnostic take on it, your direct knowledge of it. So the church fathers condemned Gnosticism before 180, after the death of Christ. Because it completely threatened their power on it. Remember, our story of Christianity is very male-centric. I mean, up until a few decades ago, Mary of Magdalene was a whore, right? Although they couldn't explain why Jesus Christ would kiss her on the mouth and she was his closest disciple, she was a whore. She was a woman, blah, 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 blah. Only men can be priests, which, by the way, before that wasn't the case. And the Gnostic churches, including Hermetic groups, have never really found that was any kind of big divide between men and women. Of course, physically, you can probably lift heavier things, but boy, I love working with women because they do things and they think about things I don't do very well by myself. So it's always a question of balance, right? But think about this condemnation of sorts from the church, and that the idea that is that our salvation flows through institutional authorities. You got to go to the priest, confess your sins, and beg for forgiveness. Me, sinful little, no, thank you. Never really did it for me. Couldn't wrap my head around it. But that is something that we can find, that same theme of Gnosticism, of being whole and united. We can find that also in the original Islamic Sufis. We can find that in the original Jewish Kabbalah. We find that, of course, in the Zoroasters and ancient Vedas, and of course the Nag Hammadi texts tell us that rightfully so, the early Christians, proto-Christians, they felt like that again, because most likely, and this is just my own theory, all of these philosophies from all over the world came and gathered right around there. Remember, anywhere from Egypt to Israel to the Greek islands, there was a lot of exchange, a lot of commerce, and of course, a lot of people and sages and merchants traveling from China. I mean, even Japan, all the way up to there. And of course, some will definitely say that even South America made it over there. There are plenty of reasons to think that, which we'll not go into this, but that gives you a really good idea of what Gnosticism is. So I sort of stopped right here for the very first part because we could talk forever about Gnosticism. But in part two, we're going to go a little bit more into, the idea of Sophia and what does it mean for us today? Where is my Sophia? Where is your Sophia? And what's at the heart of this Gnostic cosmology of sorts? Why is there a fall of Sophia and her redemption? Because there is, of course, her redemption, right? Hope you've enjoyed this. Please like, please subscribe, and also please share, because it's always good to know that, you're not living in a bubble on your own, which also means please write a comment. Let us know, what do you think? I mean, have you heard of Gnosticism? Do you know of a Gnostic center around you? Do you participate in one? What has been your experience? Those are the things we'd like to hear about. And again, if you have any topics you would like to hear about, we'd be very happy to, I would be very happy to talk about it. I'm doing right now a whole reconstruct of the website. I never really cared for it before, but I'm doing a really incredible experience, which I probably should do I will do a whole article on it, but I'm letting Claude design a website for this and having it do everything directly using my provider. And it's an incredible experience. And I'm really excited to share the results with you a little bit later, because AI has a place somewhere in spirituality. But I wanted to introduce this idea of Gnosticism. And as you know, we started in Japan. We made our way to now the middle of this world, and we will go further up north before we go into the Americas and eventually go all the way out to the Pacific Islands, which leads me to ask you one question. I am not that well versed with African lore. I've got understandings, but not enough to talk about it. So anybody knows anything about ancient African philosophies, religions, wisdom systems, please let me know. I only know a little bit about Ubuntu, and that's about it. And around the Mali places, old philosophy, the Dogon, and of course, Egypt is a little different story. But if you do know everything like that, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you all, and we'll see you. We'll see you soon again. Thank you.